Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm your host, Jaime Okan. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made cracking down on corruption a key focus of his military rule, purging hundreds of party officials and military officers accused of misconduct. Chinese military experts say these efforts will help the People's Liberation Army achieve its goal of being capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. But the purges continue to raise questions about just how deeply rooted corruption is. Joining us today is Bryce Barros. He's an associate fellow at GLOBSEC. Bryce, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
I want to first start off with, in the past couple of years, we've seen at least a dozen PLA officials and high-ranking government officials get purged as part of this effort from Chinese President Xi Jinping to manage corruption. Let's first start off with painting a picture. How big of a problem is corruption in the PLA?
Corruption is a very large problem within the PLA. It's a systemic issue, and it's related to the PLA being a party army, not a national army, and lacking that national sort of character of being nonpartisan, being as apolitical as possible, means that it loses various checks and balances that make a military even more ready because it's not focused on engaging in very deep politics, right? So having an independent judiciary within the military, inspector generals, meritocratic promotions, as much as one can have. Those are all things that get impacted by not having corruption, or rather our products of not having a corrupt system. And whereas the PLA doesn't have all that because it is a part of the CCP itself, and the CCP itself has a lot of issues that are systemic related to corruption.
In terms of corruption, you said it's a systemic thing. So then how far does this go back? I can't imagine this is a problem that Xi Jinping is facing immediately. This must have happened a couple of decades before.
I mean, it goes back to the founding of the Red Army, the PLA itself, the CCP and whatnot. I mean, all these corruption issues are systemic to the organizations themselves. They're very similar to some of the same issues that, the KMT and the ROC originally faced when they were on the mainland, related to relationships with business holdings, criminal gangs, all those different sort of issues, right? I mean, the difference is now the ROC military is not just a military for the KMT, or rather serving the KMT's interests, is a national military for the Republic of China on Taiwan. And it has all the sort of like checks and balances, transparency, and other sort of efforts that make it a national military. Despite any sort of problems it might have, it still is not anywhere near the sort of systemic corruption that you would find within the PLA itself for that reason. So the issues related to the PLA's corruption aren't something that are recent or new. It goes back to the founding of the CCP and the PLA as the armed wing of the CCP.
So is it just then the PLA that faces that specific kind of corruption, or do other militaries also face a similar issue?
I think a really good example would be North Korea. So the Korean People's Army faces similar sort of issues in terms of graft, networks that are related to doing favors for each other and other sort of similar things. That's just one immediate example here within the broader sort of Indo-Pacific region. But once again, I mean, I think what makes the PLA so different in terms of its sort of breadth and depth is the fact that it's so large. So the corruption gets amplified versus other militaries that have similar sort of issues, right? They have those levels of corruption, whereas the PLA is massive, and those issues are easily amplified in a way that you won't see in other sort of militaries. And I really want to put the emphasis on it, that the lack of transparency is what really has made the PLA far more corrupt than many other militaries around the world.
I want to get to the specifics of what kind of corruption we're looking at. Is this bribery, or is this more of a concern that Xi Jinping is actually concerned that someone wants to uproot him out from the seat of power?
I think it's all those things. I think in terms of the recent sort of changes you've seen on the CMC, I know you could probably get the sense from talking to people in Taiwan as well, other policy experts. Some of it might be related to concerns for Xi Jinping securing his fourth term. So different members or other sort of officers within the CMC who might be viewed as being too close to potential competitors of Xi Jinping, not to name names or what have you. That's a part of the corruption, but also the corruption graft also gets into like running businesses, bribery, doing favors for generals to get promotions, right? There's like a lack of a meritocratic system within the PLA, which makes it very easy for corruption to run rampant. And that even impacts billets at every sort of level. I remember talking with a well-known China hand about a decade ago about the PLA Air Force attaché in Washington, D.C., And it was an individual who didn't speak English. And you would imagine that having a PLA Air Force attaché who spoke English, who could actually communicate to the Pentagon, de-escalate issues, would be very advantageous. Most likely that person was appointed to that role because they have connections to Xi Jinping or just other sort of members of the party, and they know it's advantageous to put them in that role.
Now, Bryce, I want to get your reaction on this report that was released in March from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It says that in some parts of China, up to 65% of military officials have accepted bribes or engaged in graft. What do you make of those numbers?
I think that that's fairly accurate. It's probably higher in some different places. Once again, to get into the party, to operate within it, you need to be able to do all the Darwinistic political things that come along with working in a non-transparent system. Backstabbing, bribery, blackmail. I think you could, another good illustration for this would be, think about what happens at Beihai every year when the party gets together to meet in August, and the sort of backhand sort of like negotiations that people on the Politburo and whatnot need to go through to make deals. So, hey, I want to be able to have this secretary or what have you in this particular role here. Well, I have this dirt on you because you did this thing in the past, and being able to sort of like work those different sort of things related to corruption to make that happen. That's similar to what happens in the PLA as well. Because once again, the PLA is a part of the CCP, and that's a part of the way that the CCP does business.
So let's talk a little bit about the operational side of corruption in the sense of how it affects planning. Of course, when we look at, it looks like a good number of these corruption cases are coming from the Eastern Theater Command. Want to get your thoughts on how that affects planning in terms of a Taiwan contingency. Why is getting rid of corruption in that theater level command so important for operations around Taiwan?
So to answer that question, I want to separate the theoretical versus what has actually happened in practice. In theory, Xi Jinping and other members high up within the CCP, as well as anyone that's leading the PLA, CMC, and whatnot, they should want to make sure that that command in particular is not only loyal to Beijing, right, and make sure that they're loyal to the party itself, but they have minimal issues so that they could go ahead and have the readiness and the capability at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels to do whatever they need to do related to a Taiwan or East China Sea contingency. That said, separating the theoretical versus the practical, I do think some of the issues that you've seen related to Eastern Theater Command show that there are concerns that Xi Jinping or other people that are high up in the party have related to going into the fourth term, right? So even though in theory that particular command should have a better grasp on corruption so that they can execute Taiwan contingencies, East China Sea contingencies and whatnot in a better way, there are still issues that they have within it because people that are higher up in the party might not fully feel comfortable with certain commanders, leaders and whatnot being close with other potential rivals or other figures that could be viewed as potentially usurping or undermining Xi Jinping's sort of control within Beijing.
So I think for people watching, when they think of corruption, it's like, okay, well, of course you want good eggs in your military, you want X operation done, it's going to get done by people in the military. But I want to draw it out to comparisons to other conflicts. It's Ukraine and Russia's decision to invade. Can you talk a little bit about the issue with a leader either surrounding themselves with yes men or surrounding themselves with people that are just loyal to that person and that maybe the security of the country?
So that can manifest in a bunch of different ways, right? Related to how that went wrong for the Russians within their initial full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Having yes men around you means that you're not willing to hear hard truths about whether or not your forces have the readiness levels that they need. That also can impact command and control, right? So for example, there were interviews with Russian soldiers when the invasion, full-scale invasion was initially happening, where they didn't think that they were actually invading Ukraine. They thought it was just a training exercise because it was a training exercise until people realized, hey, we crossed the border. Those are little sort of examples of where that sort of level of corruption and also lack of having meritocratic promotions and then having very top-down command structures, right, where you don't have non-commissioned officers, small unit teams, feel empowered to be able to make very strategic, not sometimes strategic, but operational level decisions in combat that really impact the ability of a country to fight back, right? I mean, All those things are part of the reason why Ukraine was able to fight back effectively, why the Russians were easily stymied in some ways. And ironically, in places where the Russians didn't have those issues, right? Like in Syria, for example, or parts of Africa. And a lot of that came from the centralization around Putin for making that initial decision to want to do the full-scale invasion against Kyiv, and the thoughts that it would happen very quickly, and the realization that it didn't.
So do you think that maybe Xi Jinping is looking from Beijing at what's going on in Moscow and thinking, oh, wait a minute, I don't want that to happen. Let's take lessons from that and rid out any of the bad weeds we need in case there's a Taiwan contingency?
I think that is part of what the motivation is. I do think that buttresses against his concerns for securing his next term and making sure that he's clearing the deck for anyone who's viewed as a straggler for previous clique loyalties. So yes, I think, like I said in the earlier question that you had, theoretically, yes. And I know that people within the PLA definitely are thinking about that. That said, it's a corrupt system. You need to be able to sort of wheel and deal behind the scenes. That's going to run up against the ability of the PLA to focus on basic readiness issues.
I want to flip that question in terms of what can Taiwan and the United States do in exploiting those corruption issues? Is there anything that maybe Taiwan can do to make that situation even worse or put more pressure on the corruption campaign that's going in Beijing?
So I can't speak to specific sort of different things that they could do right now that exacerbate that within China. I would strongly emphasize that things that the US can do in conjunction with its allies, and this is also where you see very good examples of wanting to work with different member states of NATO, the EU, from a transatlantic perspective, is taking the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine and the initial full-scale invasion and understanding that bean counting, capabilities, equipment matters, but having that understanding of personnel, having that understanding of promotion systems, having that understanding of where meritocracy is falling very short in a military could also have significant impacts on the ability of trying to figure out different paths forward to stymie the PLA, to stymie the CCP. And I think Russia's failed invasion, right now it's at a stalemate, but falling very short of their initial objective of taking the whole country is a very good example of where policymakers and policy thought leaders within Washington, D.C., parts of Europe, and even Moscow themselves thought that they had all this sort of readiness ready, and that their bean counting and that sort of experience would be enough to really, make Kyiv capitulate early. Similar sort of issues could exist within analysis related to the PLA. So I actually think it's more important to make sure that Taiwan, allied militaries, as well as transatlantic partners have a good understanding of how they can sort of analyze defense readiness issues within the PLA itself.
My last question is going back to the bean counting, like you said, and underestimating that it's more than just equipment. We can clearly see that China is making significant advancements in shipbuilding, in missile development, and restructuring its forces for a potential Taiwan contingency. But in terms of corruption, how does that affect the modernization goal for the 2027 deadline?
I think it has a very strong impact on it. It also could mean that parts of the deadline might not be met, especially if you're getting rid of officers like the most recent changes we've seen to the CMC, who are relatively competent and are best positioned to sort of work on getting some of those capabilities so that the PLA has met the goal of having the capability of working on something related to the Taiwan, a future Taiwan contingency. I think that's like a direct example of where that meets the road of that goal.
I think that does it. Bryce, thank you so much for your insight.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, you can follow us on social media. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.